Greetings and greetings. It is such an extraordinary delight and privilege to be able to have you here speaking with our community. And I want to introduce you to them. This is my friend, Pema Khandro Rinpoché. Pema Khandro has been teaching since 1999. She was enthroned in order to carry on the lineage of the first Pema Khandro, who was a yogini from the early 20th century from Eastern Kham. And she's founded her own projects. She takes care of her own community. She founded Ngakpa International, the Buddhist Studies Institute, and the Yogic Medicine Institute. And along with being one of the few women teachers who has been enthroned in that way and has a formal and classical training, she's also one of the very few female teachers to hold a PhD in Buddhist Studies, which has been freshly minted.
Yes.
And we are going to talk about some hard topics today. If hearing about abuse is something that you find hard, it's a good moment to take some breaths and be sure that you care for yourself as you listen. And this is the first time that I've had the opportunity to connect you with our community and to speak with you formally in this way. And the topic that we're going to talk about is abuse. So why is it appropriate or necessary that we use the time that we're sitting here talking together today to talk about abuse in Buddhist communities?
Well, first let me say I'm so pleased to meet the community and thank you for having me. And it's really important that people who are experts in Buddhist traditions also partake in these conversations and support the so many people who are privately having the conversation secretly in the back room or just between friends. They would have support from people who are very informed in the tradition and have resources to share. So I think that in that way we're participating in a conversation that's happening all over the place, but it just hasn't been developed as a public discourse yet.
As a framing for our conversation, we have both been made aware of situations. We might have been confided in by people. We might have served as allies to people. We've been exposed to these situations, and we know that in many different contexts, abuse is happening in Buddhist communities to the point where it seems clear that there's a systemic issue. Why are we still Buddhists?
Why are you still a Buddhist? That's such an important question. And for me, from the beginning, when I was a young girl, my Buddhist teacher told me there are the way he framed it was, look, there are these Buddhist men who are predators, and you have to watch out for them and know that there's one type of person that's going to be like this. And this is the signs, and basically prepared me as a young girl to know what to watch out for. And so I never was in the difficult space so many people have been in, where they have a complete fall from the feeling of grace and joy of how wonderful Buddhism is, and the assumption that that means everyone would be ethical who's a Buddhist, and then the fall all the way down to the realization that no, there are some people who in the name of Buddhism abuse, and or even not just abuse, like people who can be even very toxic. And so that can be a shock a really difficult shock. And I was saved from that shock because someone told me early on, hey, you have to watch out. This is a Buddhist world. In the Buddhist world, there are these kinds of people, there are those kinds of people. This is what you have to look for. And so I didn't have to go through that drastic fall. And it gave me a kind of sobriety to walk through the Buddhist world with my eyes open, and also protected me from being susceptible to manipulation. And so for me, I am still partially I'm still a Buddhist because I was protected in that way. And I think that it's totally legitimate for some people not to still be a Buddhist. That going through the shock might be too much to recover from. And it might be too triggering to relate to Buddhist images and symbols. And if that's the case, then it's absolutely still the path of awakening, still the path of spiritual development to not be a Buddhist. But for me, I was able to be ready in a way that allowed me to be resilient. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing is, for me, mostly Buddhism has just been very healing. And it's like a center for me of peace and clarity about the purpose of life and my values. And then also too, I know Buddhist people with integrity, and that's a balance. I know teachers that have integrity, and that has helped me feel that not all Buddhists are like that. So I must also give credit to all those kind, virtuous people who've given me hope that there is a way to practice Buddhism that is absolutely virtuous. What about you? Why are you still a Buddhist?
I'm still Buddhist because the Buddhist teachings work for me.
Yeah.
They make sense to me. I certainly wouldn't say that they're the only path.
Yeah.
But the path of the Bodhisattva, the combination of a vision of what's possible for us and a recipe for cooking up that possibility is pretty powerful to me. And I also find that the paradigm of interdependence is both more convincing to me than other ontologies, and also offers, I think, something that we urgently need right now in with climate crisis and the sort of apparently coming to the logical conclusion of the forms, the modalities, and that now, as they've been globalized, have sort of shown their shortcomings.
Yeah.
So those are for me personally, but I also think that there are people who don't want to leave Buddhism.
Yes.
I know there are people who don't want to leave Buddhism, but find the contradiction between Buddhist ethics and methods that supposedly work, and then teachers who are abusing, to be a contradiction that can be a little crazy making.
Yeah.
And can I just ask you, how is it possible, how do you explain to people that there could be within Buddhism people who are practicing Buddhism but who are that type of person that your teacher warned you about?
Yeah.
Because people do wonder, does Buddhism not work then?
Yes.
If they're practicing it and that's a result?
Yeah. Well, I love that in that other question that you brought up the teaching, like for example, of interdependence, and how that is the most salient ontology, the most pressing way of seeing the world to you, or that you have a conviction about that. And I feel the same way about Yeshe, the ground of being, or the idea, the Buddha nature that's in everything. It's impossible not to see the world like that after being so steeped in it. The world for me is alive with this Buddha nature that's everywhere. So, but I think it's such a fair question. Why are people still, if they are practicing Buddhist, why would they become abusers? How could that happen? Shouldn't Buddhism work? And so actually Tibetans had their own theories about this and dealt with these problems as well. This is not a new problem. So for example, in the 14th century, in the Dzogchen text, they were trying to theorize, why do people get into sexual relationships that are bad? What happens? Why did they get into those relationships? What's so dangerous about them? What causes the harm to the community? And they were theorizing about that in the 14th century and working out these same questions. So I think that question, in that case of the example I'm saying, they answered it in terms of people getting with inappropriate consorts, that they were choosing the wrong partner. It was someone who wasn't a devout Buddhist, or someone who wasn't harmonious with the community. So that was one of their theories. And then it would lead to danger and harm for the entire Buddhist community for these wrong relationships to happen. And another example is the story of Rudra, right, which is a story, for example, in the 15th century of two students. One is a student who interprets the teachings correctly, and another is a student who interprets the teachings wrong. The one who does it wrong says, oh, because of emptiness, I can behave in whatever way I would like. I'm already naturally endowed with Buddha nature, so I don't need to do any practices, and ended up becoming more and more evil and becomes this horrible monster who eats his own mother. So it's a narrative, so it's very dramatic, right? And so, but we see in that story, it's another way of theorizing, why did two students receive the same Buddhist teaching? One became a bodhisattva, the other became a monster, a violent monster. And in that theory, it was because they misinterpreted the teachings, they misunderstood them, which I think is really important. Buddhism is difficult to practice, it's easy to misunderstand, it's difficult to apply, and not everyone gets it right, and as a result they could become a terrible monster that harms people. So I think that Tibetan Buddhists have been working on this question for a long time. Why do some people stay persistently evil? And when I think of it, I get infused with some of the other paradigms. I think about unresolved traumas, and I also think the lack of competent education about sexuality, sexual relationships, appropriate relationships is a huge problem, as well as the other two things I mentioned, like the wrong, inappropriate partners and people not applying the teachings correctly, and it being really difficult. So I think there's so many factors. But for someone, if I was training someone, like my teacher trained me and said, hey, you have to watch out for these people, I would say, you have to know in the Buddhist community there's going to be all kinds of people, and they will be all the 6 realms of being, and some of them will get it right, some of them will be totally getting it wrong and lost in their suffering and ignorance. And you have to be really careful and aware and compassionate towards them all, but also appropriately taking care of yourself in that context. Yeah.
So you're pointing out the fact that we don't have anyone who's disillusioning us or who's taking away some of the fantasies or unrealistic expectations we have about what teachers are like or what Buddhists are like.
Yeah.
So, since we bring a lot of maybe unhealthy emotional needs and unrealistic expectations to our encounters with Buddhist teachers, could you give us some some parameters for what a healthy relationship with a Buddhist teacher would look like?
Yeah, that's such an important question because the revelations that we've seen with the Me Too movement and now publicly hearing all of these stories, reading all these stories, it's very clear that the relationships with teachers and students varies greatly. In some cases, we're seeing stories that we would see as a high control cult, where the teacher is controlling every aspect of a person's life, which I was really surprised to see some of those accounts, that they were so dominated by their teacher's wishes and desires that they weren't even making their own personal decisions about who was their romantic partner or whether they were remaining celibate or not, that everything was in the hands of the teacher, so kind of high control. Then also, I've seen in Tibetan Buddhism, there are many teachers who there isn't a sense of the teacher making all your decisions or having so much influence over you, but there is more of the relationship of internalized devotion towards the teacher and wanting to please them. So it's on a more subtle level of wanting to be a good student and follow the teacher, but the teacher isn't necessarily executing this kind of what they call high control group behavior. And I've also seen teacher-student relationships that are much more casual, that they're sort of like, I think of it as the Kempo model, where they're just educating the student, but they don't have this expectation of so much responsibility and loyalty like that. And so one thing I'm bringing up to pass on what my teacher passed to me when I was a young girl is there's also all different kinds of teachers, and one should be really aware that it doesn't necessarily have to be this strict high control situation. That is, I would regard that as an aberration, that much control. And so then it's a matter of figuring out what kind of teacher is appropriate for oneself. And most of the time in the contemporary period, that might be attending classes and retreats, but then you're really going back to your life and you're quite autonomous, right? So there's so much of your life is actually in your own hands. To me, that's the model I've seen of Tibetan Buddhist teachers. That's always how it's been. But if you're someone who's an advanced student, you might end up having a very close relationship with your teacher. And that's not something everyone is going to experience. You might live with the teacher, live on the same land as the teacher at the retreat center, or travel intensively with the teacher. So there is the sense that some few people get really close to a teacher. And in that case, whether they're high control or low control, in terms of how their leadership style is, it's really important to, I think, for a student to know what they are getting guidance in and what they're not. And I think that's, maybe it's more clear in I'm speaking here in Virginia, we're in North America, and so much of how we think of teacher-student relationship is inflected with the relationship between the clergy member, like a pastor, and their congregation. And there are some parallels there, but there's also some differences. So for me, with my students, I'm aware that I'm advising them about practice, how to apply practice, but I don't see myself as having all the answers. And so I think a student has to be really aware of what they're going there for. What are they asking for? What are they looking for? Are you looking for a parental figure who has all the answers, who can save you, who can be perfect? If so, be really careful. That's a danger zone, because then you're approaching that situation like a child, and that's not an empowered position. But are you there in order to learn about practices, history, philosophy? You have to really ask yourself what it is that you're looking for in the teacher-student relationship, and yourself as you are choosing how much you want to relate to a teacher, what teachers that you're going to be with, make sure that's a match. But especially definitely to know it shouldn't be that kind of high control situation. There's something going on. But if you are an advanced student and you live with your teacher, you're traveling with your teacher all the time, then there's a whole nother set of negotiations that has to happen, right? So what are the boundaries there? And generally, the boundary we're actually referring to today is about sexuality. And you should be aware that there are different ideas about sexuality in different cultures. And there are some cultures that do believe that sexual relationships between students and teachers are acceptable and even beneficial. And certainly that's one of the paradigms within Tibetan Buddhism and its history. And so if you are that in such close proximity with a teacher, that's when it's really important to be clear what are your beliefs about that? What are your stances going to be about that? And the only way that that can really happen in an empowered way for you is you have other resources besides just that teacher. If you're very close to the teacher and they're your whole world, they're the only person that tells you about Buddhism, it will be impossible not to equate what they say with the truth of Buddhism. But the reality is Buddhism is very diverse. It could be interpreted in so many ways. There are so many different types of teachers and student-teacher relationships. So you do need to have other Buddhist resources where you are even reading Buddhist texts or going to other teachings, or you know Buddhists in other communities, so you can get a sense of what the possibilities are, what is the range of boundaries that are appropriate. But it's absolutely never necessary for you to have a sexual relationship with a teacher to get an esoteric teaching or to get a transmission. This isn't how the Buddha taught. He didn't find it necessary to give a transmission through sexual relationships. He was a celibate monk. And so oftentimes there's this sense that that's spoken of as some kind of esoteric corridor that one could go down. And if that's the only way that that teacher can teach, then that's a very limited pedagogy. And that person needs a lot more training, because there's so many ways of giving teachings and transmission. The Buddha even just held up a flower and gave transmission without even speaking or touching anyone or talking. So in terms of manner of giving teachings, esoteric teachings, secret teachings, sexual relationships are not required for that. Even in the highest, most esoteric textual traditions and traditions of empowerment and secret aspects of Tantra, it's not necessary. That's absolutely not necessary, and you should see it as a red flag if someone tells you that that's necessary. And I don't think that they're necessarily even lying to you. They maybe believe that, but it's more that that's one view. They have that view, but there are so many brilliant teachers who can teach you without that. So I think one important boundary for students to maintain and be aware of as we're talking about abuse is this just this awareness that sexual relationships with a teacher really compromise and can really complicate the relationship. It's not that it's never been beneficial and that there haven't been partnerships that came out of such relationships. We've seen that for sure historically, but most of the time it's just complicated and compromising, and it can be really harmful and damaging. And so in terms of healthy boundaries, I see that as a kind of relationship that should be avoided. Absolutely avoided, like a bad disease, that you avoid having a sexual relationship with someone who is your teacher, because it can just come with so many problems. And you want to keep one place in your life, your relationship with your teacher, that's clean and clear and a safe place and free of those other complications so that it can be a resource for you. So, I mean, that's just some things, but, I'm just realizing I've taken this class on Buddhist Healthy Boundaries that's offered by the Faith Trust Institute, which is a wonderful class, and they frame their whole teaching paradigm using examples from counseling and also pastor congregation relationships, so based on the Christian model. And I was surprised how many parallels there are. So I think also I would say one way to maintain healthy boundaries is to have, as I said, a wider knowledge, other resources, other people to talk to outside of your community. And that might not even be Buddhist, because even Christian congregations have gone through these issues. So even reading about relationships between clergy and congregation members and thinking through what the issues were there through reading those stories, that can be a way to supply and empower oneself with greater awareness of the dynamics at hand. Also, it is absolutely okay to say no to your teacher and do something other than what the teacher says. So in Buddhism, we have the ideal that, especially in Vajrayana, the Tantric and Dzogchen paths, that one should have devotion and follow their teacher's instructions. But what are those instructions, right? So they're teacher's instructions, but on what domain? When we read some of these stories of abuse, they're instructions about leaving their spouse so that that person would be available as a sexual partner for the abuser. And so that's not what's meant by the instructions in that. We're talking about how to practice meditation, not who you should be having as a sexual partner, or how these kinds of questions. So I think we could, in a very conventional way, say, yes, you should follow all your teacher's instructions, but actually the reality is most people do not follow all their teacher's instructions, and this is why it has to be said over and over again. Most people do not see their teacher as a Buddha. That's why it has to be written about over and over again in these texts, because they're obviously a human being, and so it takes this enormous focus to try and contemplate other beings as Buddhas. And so I think for a healthy boundary, you should remember even His Holiness the Dalai Lama said himself that he didn't agree with his teachers at all times. He didn't always do what they said, and that there were times he felt that what they told him was wrong, and so he didn't do them. And he did that in order to practice the authentic Buddha Dharma. So I would say that's another healthy boundary, to recognize that you as a student, you're not entering a world where everyone is so subservient that they're following their teacher's every single command. That just isn't happening even with the most excellent students, if we're frank. The reality is that there's a negotiation. People do their best to make sense of instructions they've received and integrate them into their life. And if we see the great, great practitioners, like His Holiness, they found times they had to wrestle with instructions and even go against those instructions. So I think that's also to think of oneself as a responsible spiritual adult, is to know that you are going to have to take responsibility for your decisions, for interpreting the Buddhist teachings, and sometimes that might be different than the teacher that's guiding you. And that's okay. That's always happened. Good Buddhists have always done that. It's part of how Buddhism works, is that we all wrestle with how to interpret Buddhism. So,
wow,
that's a lot. It's so much, but it's not enough. I feel like, there's so much more to say.
So we've seen in lots of different communities that abuse can happen. These relationships can become abusive. And within the relationship of a spiritual teacher to a disciple, there is a power differential. And there is a kind of religious authority where the teacher in some ways has access to the truth or has access to teachings that hold the power of truth over the students. And so that relationship is also designed to serve as a container where we feel held and secure enough to be able to let the ego fall apart and to be able to encounter and rest in a state of groundlessness. You need that sense of being held.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, we may find that the sense of security with a teacher and some sense of guidance and connection and orientation and security that is helpful actually, or is at least part of what we need to grow spiritually. On the other hand, that can become a very repressive or oppressive relationship where there is a power differential and one can end up feeling that the blessings will come from the teacher. The teacher has all the good things and the qualities, and one is asking and seeking, and it can become a very subordinate relationship. What guidance can you give for people, especially people that don't have a lot of contact with teachers, where you're cultivating a sense of devotion and trust that fulfills that purpose, that psychological comforting or security creating environment for you in your practice? You don't necessarily see the teacher, but even mentally, without having any boundaries to cross, there can be this very disempowering position that we start adopting in our relationship to teachers. How can we have the positive elements from a relationship with a teacher without having that other element creep in? How can devotion work without fundamentally ending up being disempowering to us?
Oh, that's so interesting. Can devotion work without being fundamentally disempowering? Yeah. Well, do you think that devotion is an empowering experience? Is it built in?
I don't think it's inherent. I don't feel like it's inherently empowering.
Yeah.
But I think it depends on also what kind of a relationship we experience devotion to be creating for us. And I think most of the time devotion does project some sort of superior powers or abilities on the object of our devotion.
Yeah, because I've been thinking about how one Lama that I think of in devotional terms, it's so nice to have that space in mind that I know that there's someone who is virtuous and good and benevolent and has this bodhisattva mentality, and in a sense that frees me in the world. It's like I know a safe person, and it allows me to be able to be more comfortable and creative. And so, I think there is something about experiencing devotion that frees us in a way. It's a kind of connection, it's healing. But then when it also comes with this very naive subservience, then it can be a very big problem. And we've seen that thousands of times, like millions of times. That's maybe tale as old as time. And I guess that if the question is how, I'm curious to hear what you would say for that. How do we have devotion but have it not be subservient and vulnerability to manipulation? Maybe there is no complete protection, and it's important to acknowledge that we are incredibly vulnerable in our capacity to love other beings it makes us vulnerable to harm and manipulation. If in our capacity to trust, we are vulnerable. We cannot completely be protected from that in some way as human beings. To love is to be injured and healed, and that's the profound fragility of our human life and of our mind. And but I do think there are things we could do to reduce the potential for abuse to happen. One is having the conversation to be on the table. Also, to encourage people to have other resources. Because I want to imagine us practicing Tibetan Buddhism in a Tibetan world. Like, how would that be, where we had family members who know what Buddhism should look like and who could tell us, oh no, that Lama is not a good Lama. That's the good Lama, and lots of different monasteries around and different places we could study and great teachers coming through that we could receive empowerments from. What if we had multiple vantage points on what is Buddhism the way we would if we were living in a Buddhist culture? I think that could be a protection. I don't think it's 100% protective, but I think further resources. And yeah, but I don't really know. I think that that's a difficult question. How do we, that with this very fragile experience of devotion, the vulnerability of devotion, how do we make sure that the person is still protected? Yeah, for myself, I'm always guiding them to a higher principle of the Buddha nature that's in the world, that's in the elements, that's really beyond one individual person. And so I think that's the really beautiful thing about Dzogchen, is this kind of emphasis of, and maybe it's the same in Mahamudra, of really connecting with the pervasive wisdom and emptiness that is everywhere, and that's what we're orienting towards. So I think in that sense there is a sense of devotion, but it's not like, I think what the question's referring to. Mm-hmm. But I know that is a big theme in other sanghas, of people feeling like they should have devotion, wanting to be ideal about devotion, and yeah. And it's a dangerous thing. It's also very beautiful. And I hope that people have a lot of resources to protect themselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So you've been caring for a Dharma community through the whole era of Buddhism after Me Too, or Buddhism during Me Too.
Yeah.
What have you learned from that experience?
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to make people angry that we're talking about abuse. It seems to be a very triggering thing. People feel Buddhist teachers or Buddhists shouldn't talk about it. And so in teaching during the time of Me Too, since 2017 and 18, what I've noticed is that it's not an option to not talk about it. It's being talked about. Everyone knows it's happening. And so I think that's one, is that it's absolutely essential for teachers, for lamas, for khenpos, for yogis, for monks, for nuns, Buddhist scholars, like every type of Buddhist specialist should be talking about it, because we can help inform the conversation. Also, there's so much pain that's out there. This is suffering. Buddhists are dedicated to relieving suffering, and this is one of the great sufferings in the world, and in Buddhism, Buddhist communities. And so there's just so much pain, and these topics awaken it's like a ripple effect. Even people just reading about the stories of the allegations, it's a wound, it hurts people, and it's a huge disappointment, and it's a loss of refuge. And so I feel that as a Buddhist teacher who's dedicated to helping beings relieve suffering, that's what Buddhists do, that we have to care for it. We need to address this in some way, whatever way we can. It's difficult because I feel so limited and inadequate to the task. Abuse is something that happens in every religion, every neighborhood, every place, every world. It's in our institutions, it's at home, and so it's so huge. It's hard to adequately address it, but I think we should all try our best and go ahead and make the mistakes and address this pain, that this so much pain is out there, and people need a space that that pain is being acknowledged and that there's some care about the suffering that's taken place. I've also learned that it's an incredible amount of emotional labor, and just to speak frankly, maybe since there isn't a lot of talk about these things, I do also want to be honest that it's really terrifying to speak about these things publicly. I don't want to re-traumatize people. I don't want to just speak in the wrong way. Also, it's so triggering, and there's so much anger, and then also, having to navigate all the people I'm responsible to. It's a lot of emotional labor, and I think it's not a work that can be taken lightly. It takes a lot of time and energy to be able to speak about it, and speak about it publicly with my students, to do the classes with my students. When I've done the classes with my students, there's so many conversations before the class, the preparation for the class, all the conversations afterwards. It's a huge labor, and we're all doing it, even if we're not in a community where there was a scandal. It's requiring an immense amount of emotional work and time. So I think that's one of the things that I found out. At first I thought, oh, it's just me. Afterwards I feel terrible, after these conversations. But then I heard another scholar doing work in this say, no, it's an intense amount of emotional labor. And so I want to acknowledge that just talking about these things can be really anxiety provoking. And that's okay. There's space for us to wade through it as best we can and take time to care for ourselves and attempt to make sense of what we're hearing and learning. Yeah. What about you? What have you learned from caring for a community through these Me Too allegations?
Yeah, I think I've learned that there's a huge amount of mistakes to be made.
Yeah.
A lot of resistance to having it talked about.
Yeah.
People who want to just say, oh, we don't have enough information to make a decision, so let's not talk about it.
Yeah.
A lot of pressure to silence the issue.
Yeah.
Very much as in a family, if some important figure in the family is accused, we're going to split the family, so we shouldn't talk about it to hold the family together. So there's a lot of emotional danger for people in talking about it. There's a lot of psychological structures that we've built up unconsciously during our time in the Dharma, where the figure who is the teacher may be playing a psychological role for us that we're not really able to do without. So a lot of resistance to talking about it.
Yeah.
And I also know that not talking about it makes everyone in the community feel unsafe.
Yeah.
Because they can't trust that if there are allegations, someone will be sure to follow up and figure out whether it's true or not.
Yeah.
And so just as you say, the emotional labor, how exhausting it is to host conversations like that, prepare yourself, follow up with people later, is enormous.
Yeah.
And to me, it's just terrifying what kind of communities we will be creating if we don't figure out how to acknowledge the fact that things might go wrong, and if they do, we want to put the people who have suffered at the center.
Yeah.
we want to care for the vulnerable. As part of a Buddhist community, we want, to put the people who are, unprotected, in precarious situations, who are being harmed, who are vulnerable, we want to take them in our care. And if we won't listen to them when they're speaking out, or all the other things that keep happening, it's first of all, who will be left in those communities finally, and what does it do to us if we think that we have refuge and some part of us knows that it might not be a safe refuge because there are these things, but we don't want to hear about them. What does that do to everyone in the community, and what does it do to the Dharma? So I'm hosting this conversation because I'm profoundly concerned about the impact, of course, on survivors of abuse, also on people who've survived abuse in other contexts and think they're in a safe space and then start to find out that maybe they're not. But also for the Dharma, if it's being transmitted in contexts where it is being misused, I'm concerned, and I'm also aware that I need to talk to a lot of people to get wisdom on how to do it.
Yes, that's so important, and that's what I became aware of, that I've talked with so many people about these topics, so many Buddhist teachers, practitioners, also privately hearing people's testimonies of abuse and everything that led up to it and the aftermath. All those conversations were like an archive of secrets, each one of us, of so many conversations. And so it is important for us to bring other people into the conversation in ways we can, even though it's very dangerous for us to do that. Really dangerous in some ways. And but I think that the danger is also, there's a good danger too, which we're Buddhists. Our goal is to investigate reality, to see how things really are, to stare at how things are directly, see what the Buddha saw, see all the karma. He didn't just on that night of enlightenment see all the good things that human beings have done, right? He saw the karma of all beings, and to see into the world and make sense of evil, that's also part of being a Buddhist. And so in that sense, we are doing Buddhist practice by looking at these very difficult topics. Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Well, thank you so much for hosting me, and I just feel really lucky to be able to talk with your teacher and to count her as a friend, and how fortunate you are to be in a community that's looking at these issues in a very direct and honest way. It's difficult, but I think it will lead to further awakening and further maturity, and hopefully it will be a protection for everyone listening, and maybe a salve for those who weren't believed. We believe you.